On the 6th of September 1997, a 33-year-old man rose inside Westminster Abbey, walked to a microphone watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people, and spent the next few minutes saying out loud the one thing the royal family had spent a frantic week praying nobody would say at all. Charles Spencer, 9th Earl Spencer, had buried relatives in that building before. This time he buried his sister, and somewhere in the middle of a eulogy the palace had never seen, never approved, and could not stop, a sound drifted in from the wrong direction. The applause started outside on the street, rolled through the great west doors, and swept up the nave like a tide coming in, until the mourners seated near the coffin found themselves clapping too. Inside a church at a funeral, for a man scolding the family in the front pew, the royals sat very still. You already know the version of what happened next. The heartbroken brother pushed past the edge, turned on the cold machine that had used his sister up and discarded her, and told them so to their faces in front of the whole planet. The loyal champion who loved Diana more than anyone finally handed a microphone and a global audience, drawing his sword in the one room where the family could not strike back. Heck of a story. Genuinely one of the most electric things ever broadcast live from a funeral. The kind of moment people still describe with a small shiver 30 years on. There's just one problem. Almost none of the tidy version survives a close look. And when you line up what Spencer actually said against what he had been doing in the months right before he said it, the speech stops reading like the cry of a devoted brother and starts reading like something far more uncomfortable and far more human. So let me rewind to the start, because the man who delivered that speech and the man Diana actually dealt with in the last year of her life were not quite the same person. And the gap between those two men is the whole story. Charles Edward Maurice Spencer arrived in May 1964, the long-awaited boy in a family that had been desperate for one. The Spencers were not minor gentry playing at grandeur. They were one of the oldest aristocratic families in England, sitting on a Northamptonshire estate called Althorp that had belonged to them since the early 16th century. Packed with art and silver and 500 years of accumulated certainty. Diana came third of the surviving children born in 1961. Then finally, after her Charles, a male heir for the earldom. The one thing the title required, and the one thing the three daughters could never provide, no matter how clever or charming they turned out to be. He and Diana were the two youngest, close in age and closer in circumstance. There had actually been another boy before either of them, an infant brother named John, who died within hours of his birth in 1960. And the desperation for a son had hung over the household like weather. When Diana arrived a year later, a healthy young girl rather than the longed-for boy, the disappointment was quiet but real, and she grew up half aware of it. Then Charles came along 3 years on and resolved the problem simply by existing. He was the answer to a question Diana had failed to answer just by being born female. That is not a thing you say out loud in a nice family, and the Spencers were very nice on the surface, but it sat there in the foundations all the same. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Their parents' marriage detonated when the two youngest were small. Their mother, Frances, left in the mid-1960s, and what followed was a vicious, headline-making divorce and a custody fight that the children experienced as a slow earthquake. The detail that scarred them most was the testimony. Frances's own mother, the children's grandmother, took the husband's side in court and helped ensure that custody went to the father rather than the mother. Diana and Charles got the rawest end of all of it because they were the two still small enough to be properly frightened by the shouting and the silences and the suitcases by the door. Charles has spoken, decades later, about a specific memory that never left him. The sound of his mother's car crunching down the gravel drive away from the house, and his own small voice and Diana's calling after her, and the car not stopping. People who write about the eulogy love that childhood. The two abandoned kids clinging to each other in a cold grand house, and the grown-up loyalty that supposedly flowed straight out of it. The bond was real, I want to be clear about that. But a shared childhood wound does not actually guarantee that two adults will stand by each other when it counts, and in this particular family, it mostly didn't. Shared trauma can bind people. It can also teach them, very young, that the people who are supposed to protect you will choose something else when the moment comes. And Charles Spencer learned both of those lessons in the same house at the same time. And which one won on any given day is a question that follows him right up to that microphone in 1997. He was sent away to boarding school young, the way boys of his class always were, packed off with a tuck box bearing his name in painted letters. There is a photograph of one of those tuck boxes, D. Spencer stenciled on the side, being loaded into the family Bentley, before a small Diana stood waiting to be driven off to school. And something about that image, a little girl's whole world reduced to a wooden box in the boot of a car, tells you more about the emotional climate of that family than any biography could. They were rich beyond ordinary imagining, and they were lonely in a way that money makes worse rather than better, because money buys distance, and distance was the family's native language. Their father, the 8th Earl Spencer, died in March 1992 after years of declining health. Charles was 27. Overnight, the boy who had grown up knowing the house was coming to him actually got it, the full inheritance, the title, Althorp, and everything inside its walls, while his 3 older sisters received comparatively little, because that is how English aristocratic primogeniture has always worked, and the Spencers were nothing if not traditional about it. Diana and her 2 sisters, Sarah and Jane, watched the entire 500-year estate pass to the youngest sibling, the only brother, simply because he had been born a boy. Nobody in the family seems to have regarded this as unjust at the time. It was simply the rule, as fixed as gravity, and you did not argue with gravity in that world. You arranged your life around it. So picture the family as it stood by the middle of the 1990s. Diana, the most famous woman alive, photographed more often than any human being on Earth, trapped inside a collapsing royal marriage and increasingly cut adrift from the institution she had married into at 20. And her little brother, now the Earl, master of the ancestral pile, keeper of the family seat, the one Spencer, with a fortress to offer, and the legal title to offer it. 2 children of the same broken home, grown up now, sitting at opposite ends of a strange seesaw. She had the fame and none of the ground beneath her feet. He had the ground and comparatively little of the fame, which suited him, because he had inherited the family's loathing of the press, along with the family's silver, which matters enormously, because in those years Diana wanted exactly one thing from him. She wanted to come home. By 1996, the royal marriage was finished in every sense that counted. The separation had come in 1992, the same year their father died, and the years between had been a public bloodbath of leaked tapes, rival, interviews, and a slow-motion war conducted through the newspapers that both sides claimed to despise. The divorce was finalized in August 1996, and the term stripped something from Diana that the public barely registered at the time. She lost the styling of Her Royal Highness. She was permitted to keep the title Diana, Princess of Wales, but the HRH was gone, and inside that world the HRH is not an administrative footnote. It is the membership card. It is the difference between being family and being a guest, who is graciously allowed to stay for dinner. Within the rigid choreography of royal life, an HRH must be curtsied to. Stripped of it, Diana, the mother of the future king, would now have to curtsy to junior members of the family who outranked her, and everybody involved understood exactly what that signified. She had been, in the most genteel possible manner, demoted out of the firm. She was 35. She was internationally adored, photographed obsessively, courted by charities and celebrities and statesmen, and quietly, profoundly unmoored. She was living at Kensington Palace inside an institution that now regarded her with the wary politeness you extend to a former colleague who knows where the bodies are buried. And she started thinking, the way people do when the ground shifts under them, about somewhere that felt like solid family ground, about Althorp, about the house she had been driven away from in a Bentley as a child, which had since become, in her imagination at least, The one place on earth where the name on the gate was her own family's name rather than the one she had just been divorced out of. So she asked her brother for a house on the estate, not the main hall, not anything grand, a cottage. There was a property on the Althorp grounds called the Garden House, a modest three-bedroom place by the ashes of an estate that measured itself in square miles, and Diana set her heart on it specifically. The idea, by every surviving account, was almost painfully ordinary. The most hunted woman in the world wanted a small house near her childhood home, tucked behind the walls of a private estate, where the cameras could not reach her, and where, for the first time since she was 19 years old, she could exist as a person rather than as a permanent national event. She wanted, in plain terms, to go home and be a Spencer again, since being a Windsor had nearly destroyed her. Charles said no. This is the part the eulogy left out, and it is the part that turns the entire familiar story inside out. The brother who would stand up at Westminster Abbey and pledge before 2 billion people to protect Diana's children, as her loyal blood family had within the previous 11 months, declined to give Diana herself a roof on the family land when she got down and actually asked for one. Now, in fairness, and this story demands fairness at every turn, or it collapses into a cartoon, he offered reasons, and the reasons were not absurd. The Garden House sat only about 100 yards from a public road. Spencer worried, with genuine justification given everything that was about to happen, about security, about the circus of photographers and sightseers and obsessives that trailed his sister everywhere she set foot. He has said since more than once that he made what he believed was the right decision for her safety, and that Diana simply could not see it that way at the time. He did not show her the door empty-handed. He offered alternatives, other properties on or near the estate, including a 16th-century manor house called Wormleighton, the family's original ancestral home. The point worth holding is that he tried to give her something. It just was not the thing she had asked for, and the thing she had asked for was the thing she wanted, and she turned the alternatives down. Years later, when newspapers wrote this episode up in the harshest possible terms, painting Spencer as a cold aristocrat who slammed the door on his drowning sister and as good as helped kill her, he sued them. And he won more than once. The Times was forced to print a correction acknowledging that he had in fact offered her a number of properties, that he had been weighing real security advice from the police, and that it had been wrong to imply he was in any way to blame for her death. The Daily Mail had earlier paid him libel damages over a similar story. So the cartoon of a heartless brother turning Diana out into the night is not accurate either, and the courts have said so with money attached. The truth sits in the uncomfortable middle, which is where the truth in this whole saga insists on living, no matter how hard everyone pulls it toward one edge or the other. He did not abandon her. He also did not give her the one specific thing she actually asked for. And she felt the refusal as a rejection, regardless of how reasonable his logic was on paper. Because that is precisely how rejection works when you are drowning, and you reach for the person who is supposed to be solid ground, and discover that even he comes with conditions. Even he has a member of staff who needs the cottage more than you do. Even he is going to be sensible about your safety at the exact moment you are begging not to be managed, but to be taken in. Hold on to that, because it sits underneath everything that came next like a stone in a shoe. Diana died on the 31st of August 1997 in a car in a Paris underpass, fleeing photographers, with the photographers following anyway, and at least one of them, by some accounts, photographing her as she lay dying in the wreckage. She was 36 years old. And the man who would deliver the most famous defense of her in the history of public speaking was a man who, less than a year before, had not been able to give her a place to live when she asked. Now, the death itself and the extraordinary week that followed, because the speech did not happen in a vacuum, and you cannot understand why it landed the way it did without understanding the powder keg it was dropped into. The funeral became the strange, charged, half-revolutionary event. It did not purely because of what Spencer said, but because of the 7 days of escalating public fury that came before he said it. When the news broke that Sunday morning, the royal family was at Balmoral, the Scottish estate, where they spent every late summer surrounded by heather and grouse moors, and roughly the entire 19th century preserved in amber. William was 15, Harry was 12. The Queen made what she clearly regarded, from inside her own framework, as a sensible and protective decision. She kept the boys at Balmoral, away from the cameras and the chaos, took the family to church that morning much as planned, and otherwise had everyone go quiet, because going quiet behind thick stone walls was what this family had always done with grief, for as long as it had existed. Privacy was not coldness in their minds. Privacy was dignity. Privacy was love expressed the only way they knew how to express it. The country read it completely differently, and the gap between those two readings is the most consequential misunderstanding in modern royal history. Then there was the flag. The flag over Buckingham Palace stayed down, and the press treated the bare flagpole as proof of a hard heart at the center of the nation. The truth was duller and more bureaucratic. The only flag flown above Buckingham Palace was the royal standard, and it flew only when the monarch was physically in residence, and the Queen was in Scotland, so the pole stood empty exactly as protocol demanded. On top of that, the royal standard never flew at half-mast, ever, under any circumstances, because the standard represents the sovereign as a continuing institution, and the institution, constitutionally speaking, never dies. The instant one monarch stops breathing, the next one inherits, which is the whole grim point of the phrase, "The king is dead, long live the king." By the palace's own internal logic, lowering that flag would have been not respect, but a kind of constitutional nonsense. To the palace, this was simply correct. To a grieving public standing at the railings, staring up at a bare pole over a silent, apparently empty palace, while the streets below them filled with a sea of flowers and weeping strangers, it read as the establishment turning its back. And the tabloids, the very papers that had hounded Diana for 16 straight years, and arguably helped chase her into that tunnel, performed one of the most shameless pivots in the history of journalism. Overnight, they reinvented themselves as the pure voice of the people's grief, and aimed every barrel they had straight at the royal family for being cold. "Where is our Queen? Show us you care. Speak to us, ma'am." The same machine that had built its profits on photographing Diana into an early grave was now thundering, in 72-point type, that the royals did not love her enough. The monarchy had misread the moment catastrophically. They thought they were observing dignified restraint. The country thought they were observing nothing at all, and the country's mood by the middle of that week curdled from sorrow into something that genuinely frightened the people, whose job it was to keep the institution standing. There was loose, half-serious talk in the papers about whether the monarchy could even survive this. Tony Blair, the new prime minister, only months into the job, was working the phones frantically, trying to coax a bewildered palace into understanding that the rules that had served them for 1,000 years were, this one time, about to get them all swept away. To her enormous credit, the Queen recognized it before it was too late. She came back to London. She got out of the car and walked among the oceans of flowers and cellophane and handwritten cards outside the palaces, reading them, letting herself be seen. She agreed to a live television broadcast, almost unheard of, and spoke to the nation as, in her words, a grandmother, which was about as much raw human feeling as that famously contained woman had ever shown in public. And they lowered a flag. Not the royal standard, that rule held. But they broke a different convention entirely and ran the Union flag up the Buckingham Palace pole, and then brought it to half-mast, the first time in the building's history that any flag had flown there at half-mast for anyone. The institution bent because the alternative was to break, and a 1,000-year-old institution will do almost anything rather than break. That is the atmosphere the funeral landed in, not solemn, ordered national unity. Raw, electric, slightly feral public emotion, shot through with a real and dangerous current of anger, pointed directly at the royal for what had looked, all week, like indifference toward the woman the nation had decided to love more in death than the family had been willing to love her in life. The country was primed like a struck match held next to petrol. And into that supercharged room, holding a single piece of paper, walked Diana's brother. Here is a detail almost nobody knows, and it complicates the legend of the fearless avenger more than any other single fact. Spencer did not want to give the speech. He did not volunteer to seize the great moment. He tried with real determination to make it somebody else's problem. He had been living in South Africa at the time, in Cape Town, having moved his family thousands of miles away, precisely to put an ocean between his children and the British press he hated. He flew back overnight, gutted, leaning on what he later described as a very sweet flight attendant who could see he was in pieces. And he spent that long flight not composing soaring tributes, but going through his address book, letter by letter, A to Z, hunting for anyone, literally anyone, suitable to deliver the eulogy in his place. He reached Z and found no one. He landed at Heathrow, phoned his mother, and told her he had a terrible feeling it was going to have to be him after all. His mother's response settled it. She told him that yes, of course it was going to be him, because she and his sisters had already decided that days ago, and were simply waiting for him to arrive at the conclusion himself. So the man cast by history as the brother who grabbed his chance to strike at his enemies was, in plain documented fact, a reluctant conscript who tried to hand the job to every name in his contacts, and only accepted it when his own mother informed him the decision had been made over his head. Whatever else the eulogy was, it did not begin as an act of eager defiance. It began as a duty he flinched from and could not escape. He sat down to write it, and the first thing he wrote, by his own later account, was wrong. It was a conventional eulogy, the gentle, sepia-toned, she was always so good with people kind, full of warm childhood anecdotes and soft edges. He read it back and recoiled, because that tidy, comfortable version was simply not who Diana had been, and, more to the point, not what had actually happened to her. The polite version would have been a lie of omission, and he knew it, so he tore it up. He has said the real speech, the one the world remembers, took him about 90 minutes to write, and that the thing which unlocked it was a single decision. He decided his job was not to speak about Diana. His job was to speak for her, to say the things she could no longer say for herself, with the two boys she had left behind sitting directly across the coffin from him, where he would have to look them in the eye while he said it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And what did he actually say? Stripped the legend away and read the thing cold, line by line. And it is a stranger and more carefully constructed document than the brother declares war framing allows. He opened conventionally enough, calling himself the representative of a family in grief, in a country in mourning, before a world in shock, which is about as standard as a state funeral opening gets. Then he praised her, lavishly and genuinely, and there is no reason to doubt a word of it. He called her the very essence of compassion, of duty, of style, of beauty. He called her a standard bearer for the rights of the truly downtrodden, a very British girl who somehow transcended nationality and belonged to the entire world. He landed the line that everybody quotes, the one that has outlived almost every other sentence spoken that decade. That of all the ironies about Diana, the greatest was this, that a girl given the name of the goddess of hunting became, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age. He has said since that the line summed up the entire force of the anger he felt toward the people who had done that to her, and you can hear in it exactly where his fury was pointed, at the press, at the cameras, at the machine that turned a human being into prey. So far, this is a brother defending his sister against the paparazzi, and there was not one soul in that abbey who would have stood up to argue with him about the paparazzi. The press was the safe target. Everyone in the country hated the press that week, the press very much included, busily hating itself on the front pages while it sold record numbers of memorial editions. Attacking the photographers cost Spencer nothing and united the room behind him. The part that made the royal family go rigid came afterward, and it was quieter and more surgical than its thunderous reputation suggests. He turned to William and Harry, sitting feet away across their mother's coffin, and he made them a promise out loud. He said that on behalf of Diana's mother and her sisters, he, her blood family, would do everything they could to continue the imaginative way she had been raising her sons, so that, in his exact phrase, Their souls would not be simply immersed by duty and tradition, but could sing openly as she had planned. And then he added, with great care, that they fully respected the heritage into which the boys had been born, and would always respect and encourage them in their royal role. But that, like Diana, they recognized the need for the boys to experience as many different aspects of life as possible. Read it again slowly, because it is a small masterpiece of saying the dangerous thing, while leaving yourself a door to retreat through. On the surface, it is gracious. He nods to the monarchy. He respects the royal role. He sounds on a first listen entirely supportive. But the load-bearing words in the whole passage are blood family, and they are aimed like a rifle at the people in the front pew. In that one phrase, he draws a hard line between Diana's blood relatives, the Spencers, and the family she married into, the Windsors, and he announces, in front of 2.5 billion people, that the Spencers fully intend to have a hand in how the future King of England gets raised. The man sitting only a few feet from that coffin, the boy's father, the actual heir to the throne of the United Kingdom, had just been informed at his former wife's funeral, in the most public forum that has ever existed on Earth, that certainly did not entirely trust his family to do the job properly. And the phrase duty and tradition was not neutral either. In most rooms, it might pass as harmless. In that specific room, duty and tradition had names and faces and crowns, and they were sitting right there listening to themselves be gently identified as the thing that might smother 2 children's souls. Everybody present understood it. The discomfort in the Abbey was not imagined. It was earned, syllable by syllable, by a man who knew exactly what he was doing with the soft words and the hard meaning underneath them. So yes, it was a shot, a real one, and the family felt it. But look closely at the angle of the shot, because the angle is where the official story of the noble avenging brother quietly falls apart. The sentence that did the actual damage was not "you killed her," and it was not "you cast her out," and it was not any direct accusation about the divorce or the lost HKH or the bare flagpole. The sentence that did the damage was a claim of custody, a claim of influence over the upbringing of 2 boys. And here is the thing that the legend has spent 30 years carefully not mentioning. Charles Spencer had no legal standing to make that pledge whatsoever, and he knew it perfectly well as the words left his mouth. He has admitted as much himself, with disarming honesty, in the years since. Diana had, informally and privately, wanted him to act as a guardian to her sons if anything happened to her. It carried no force in law, none. And with the boy's father not merely alive but the literal heir to the throne, raising them with the entire apparatus of the monarchy behind him, the notion that the Spencers were going to be co-steering William and Harry's upbringing was, in any practical sense, a fantasy. Spencer has described it since as a duty he felt rather than a duty he actually held, which is a beautiful and very telling way to put it. The other parent being alive, he has said, meant the guardianship meant nothing in reality, but it meant something to him. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes the most famous moment of the entire funeral. He stood up at a state occasion and promised on behalf of the dead to do something he had no power on earth to actually do, in front of the one family most able to ensure he would never get the chance to do it. It was not a battle plan. It was a vow made into the wind. Magnificent, sincere, moving, and operationally hollow, all at the same time. Then came the applause, and the applause is the single detail that tells you the speech was never really aimed at the royals at all. It was aimed at the crowd, and the crowd answered. When Spencer finished, the people standing outside in Hyde Park and along the route, watching on the giant screens that had been set up for the day, began to clap, and the sound did something no one had planned for. It rolled in through the open west doors of the Abbey, up the great stone nave, and the congregation inside, the ordinary mourners and the charity workers and the celebrities, and eventually almost everyone, picked it up and joined in, until the whole of Westminster Abbey was applauding a eulogy that had encoded but unmistakable language, just rebuked the head of state and her heir at a religious service. Applause inside that church at a funeral. It had, as far as anyone could tell, simply never happened before in the building's 1,000-year life. The royal family did not clap, and why on earth would they? They sat in the dead center of a building full of people, applauding a man for telling them, with exquisite politeness, that they had failed. There is no graceful response available to you in that situation. You cannot applaud your own rebuke, and you cannot visibly refuse to. So you sit very still and you wait for it to end, and you let 2.5 billion people watch you absorb it, which is exactly what they did. That is the image that froze into legend and has never thawed since. The brother as tribune of the people, the family as cold defendants in the dock, the nation roaring its verdict through the open doors. It is a tremendous piece of theater, genuinely one of the great pieces of unscripted live theater of the century. But theater is the precise word, because the version that hardened into accepted fact skips every single inconvenient thing we have just walked through. It skips the cottage he would not give her. It skips the address book and the desperate A to Z search for somebody else to do the job. It skips the fact that the pledge at the molten heart of the whole speech was legally weightless, and he knew it. And it skips, most awkwardly of all, what Spencer actually did in the years after the cameras left, which is where the distance between the funeral Charles Spencer and the everyday Charles Spencer becomes almost too neat to believe. Because the brother who pledged before the world to continue Diana's work and protect her boys was not, by any reasonable measure, an enormous presence in those boys' lives afterward. The dramatic guardianship he announced from the lectern never materialized into anything resembling co-parenting. And it was never going to, because their father was raising them, and their father was going to be king. And that was the end of the matter. This is not in itself a scandal. It is simply reality reasserting itself the instant the funeral ended and the abbey emptied out. The fantasy could survive 90 minutes under stained glass. It could not survive the following Monday morning. But it does mean that the most quoted promise of the decade was, in functional terms, a promise made for the room rather than for the children. It comforted a grieving nation. It put the royals on notice. It moved 2.5 billion people to tears. And then, in the practical business of actually raising William and Harry, it more or less evaporated, as everyone present that day, Spencer included, must have known on some level that it would. And then there is Althorp itself, the house at the center of everything, which delivers the final and almost unbearable irony of the whole story. After Diana died, Spencer made the decision about where she would rest, and he chose home. He buried her on the estate, on a small island in the middle of an ornamental lake called the Round Oval, reachable only by boat, sealed off entirely from the public. The reasoning he gave was sound and even tender. He wanted her resting place to be somewhere her sons could visit in genuine peace, somewhere the cameras and the crowds and the obsessives who had tormented her alive could never reach her in death. An island in a private lake achieves that better than any public chapel ever could. There had once been a footbridge to the island. He had it removed so that the only approach is by water, so that nobody uninvited ever sets foot there. Whatever you think of the man, that is the act of someone determined that his sister will finally, in death, get the privacy she was denied for every day of her adult life. He built a memorial, a small classical temple by the water, where the public, kept well back from the grave itself, could come and leave flowers and pay their respects. And he opened Althorp, the great house and its grounds, to paying visitors. But, and here is the detail that stops you cold once you notice it, he opened it for only 2 months of the year. July and August, look hard at those dates. The visiting season runs from the 1st of July, which is Diana's birthday, to the end of August, which brackets the 31st, the day she died. The estate that had not been able to find her a cottage to live in became, after her death, a carefully managed place of pilgrimage that the public pays to enter, and its annual opening is bookended with almost poetic precision by the anniversary of her birth at one end and the anniversary of her death at the other. Spencer has defended every part of this, frequently and often successfully in court, and it has to be said that his defenses are not flimsy. The estate costs a genuine fortune simply to keep standing, a grade I-listed house 5 centuries old with grounds to match, and the visitor income and the periodic auctions of family heirlooms go toward that upkeep. The grave needed to be somewhere truly secure and truly private, And the island delivers exactly that. Run the whole arrangement through the most generous available lens, and you get a grieving brother doing the unglamorous, expensive, thankless work of guarding his sister's memory and her body from the same machine that hunted her while she breathed, and weathering decades of cheap accusations that he is cashing in on her corpse, accusations he has repeatedly proven false in front of judges. Run it through the harshest lens, and you get a man who refused his living sister a home on his land. And then, once she was safely dead, built a beautifully maintained and modestly profitable monument to her on that same land, open to ticket holders on a calendar shaped around her own birth and death. Both readings are available. Both have evidence behind them. And the honest answer, once again, sits in that maddening middle where this entire story has refused to leave. Because Charles Spencer is not a villain, and he is not a saint, and he has spent 30 years living in the narrow, contested ground between the two, defending his choices, suing the newspapers that flatten him into either caricature, and visiting his sister's grave on that island, by his own account, very nearly every single day of his life since. So why did Diana's brother turn on the royals at her funeral? The legend hands you a clean and satisfying answer, the kind that fits on a thumbnail and never troubles you afterward. Love, he loved her. They failed her. He stood up and said so to their faces because somebody finally had to. And there is real truth in that. I am not going to pretend otherwise. He did love her. The grief was bottomless and entirely genuine. And the family had, in life and in death both, handled her with a coldness the whole country could feel radiating off the palace walls that week. None of that is invented, and none of it should be waved away. But the clean answer ignores the actual man, and the actual man is far more interesting than the legend. The Charles Spencer who rose in that abbey was carrying a great deal more than grief. He was carrying guilt over a cottage. The specific private knowledge that the last meaningful thing his sister had asked of him, he had answered with a no, however well-reasoned. He was carrying a lifetime of his own venomous hatred of the press, which had hounded him too, which he blamed with real justice for her death, and which he was now in a position to flay in front of the largest audience in human history. He was carrying the particular rage of a man who had watched the institution strip Diana of her HRH and her standing, and then, in his view, fail even to keep her safe, fail even to mourn her properly. And underneath all of it, he was carrying the reluctant, conscripted weight of a job he had begged the universe and his address book to hand to literally anyone else. When he drew that line between blood family and the Windsors, he was not only defending Diana, he was, in the same breath, relitigating his own place in her story. He was claiming, in front of 2.5 billion witnesses, the role of devoted protector at the precise moment that role could no longer be tested against the harder, quieter truth of what his protection had actually looked like while she was alive and asking for a roof. The microphone offered him 90 minutes to write the official record of who he had been to his sister. And, like almost any of us would have in that grief, and that guilt, and that blaze of attention, he wrote the version he could live with for the rest of his life. He wrote himself whole. That is not villainy. It is also nowhere near sainthood. It is something far more ordinary and far more recognizably human than either of the cartoons. A man who loved his sister, failed her in a small but real and unforgettable way, lost her with horrifying suddenness and violence, and then was handed a lectern and an impossible global stage on which to settle his account with her, and with the family he blamed, and with himself. He took the chance. Of course he took the chance. The wonder would have been if he hadn't. The royal family absorbed the blow and said precisely nothing, because saying nothing under fire is the one thing that institution has always done supremely well. They sat through the applause. They buried the mother of the future king, and they let it pass into history without a word of public complaint, which was almost certainly the wisest thing they could have done, since any response at all would only have confirmed the verdict the Abbey had just delivered. The boys grew up, which is the part that actually matters, and the part both families, for once, genuinely agreed on. William folded himself into duty and tradition exactly as everyone expected. The dutiful elder son, the future king, the steady one. Harry took a very different road, and decades later, in his own memoir, he described sitting in that abbey as a stunned 12-year-old and feeling his uncle use the allotted time to blast everyone in reach, family and nation and press alike, for stalking his mother to her death. He wrote that you could feel the abbey, and the whole nation outside it, recoil from the blow. And he summed the moment up in 3 words: truth hurts. Whether the uncle who delivered that truth had fully earned the right to deliver it is a question Harry did not raise, and one the legend has been very carefully arranged never to ask. Because once you ask it, once you put the cottage next to the eulogy, the address book next to the applause, the closed-off island next to the refused front door, the whole clean story stops being a story about a brave brother and a wicked family, and becomes something murkier and sadder, and a great deal closer to how families actually work. Everybody in it convinced they were doing the decent thing. Everybody in it failing somebody. And nobody, least of all the man at the microphone, quite as simple as the legend needs them to be. What stings about the truer version is the same thing that stings in every royal story worth telling, which is that it hands you no clean villain to hiss at and no clean hero to cheer. Not a cold establishment that simply destroyed a luminous woman for sport, though heaven knows it was cold and it did help destroy her. Not a fearless brother who simply rode in and avenged her, though it took real nerve to stand in that abbey and say half of what he said. Just a family of damaged, articulate, formidable people, bound together by blood and a broken childhood, and 500 years of history, each one privately certain they were behaving honorably, and one woman at the dead center of all of it, who had asked, near the end, for nothing grander than a small house near where she grew up, and was told gently, reasonably, with excellent and well-documented security justifications, no. She is buried now on that island, behind the boat and the water and the locked-off shore, in the grounds of the house that would not take her in while she was alive to enjoy it. Her brother visits nearly every day, cuts flowers from the gardens for her on the worst anniversaries, and calls it always an impossible day. Make of that whatever you can. I have turned it over more times than I can count, and I still cannot decide whether it is the saddest part of the entire story or the most loving. And I have slowly come to suspect it is both at the very same time, which is usually the sign that you have finally stopped believing the legend and started actually looking at the people inside it. So I will hand the verdict over to you, because it was never really mine to give. When Charles Spencer rose at that funeral and turned on the royals in front of the watching world, was he the one person in that building brave and honest enough to say what needed saying? Or was he a grieving, guilty man, handed the largest stage in history, quietly writing himself a far better part than the one he had actually played in his sister's final lonely year? Tell me down in the comments which way you land. I genuinely want to know, because 30 years on, I am still not sure I have landed anywhere myself. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.